What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 93, and I am the host, Kyle Anslone. Today, the guest is my good friend, Patrick McFarlane from the Liberty Weekly podcast. Pat, how's it going?
It's going good, Kyle. Glad to be back on.
I'm excited to have you on today because I think maybe in part our last conversation and a lot of the content that you've been producing, and you have a new article coming out of the Libertarian Institute that should be out by the time this podcast is published, but if not, be on the lookout for it in the next couple of days. We're using a preview of your article here to go through. So if there's any typos or anything like that, I'm sure Pat will get it cleaned up. No need to go on about in the comment section. But be sure to check out the libertarianinstitute.org, where my podcast is hosted, where you can also find the Liberty Weekly podcast, as well as podcasts by Keith Knight, Pete Quinona, Scott Horton, and Tommy Solomons. So a great lineup of shows there. Think about checking out the social media for the podcast. We're on MeWe, Facebook, and Twitter. Pat, you have accounts up at all those places too, right?
I do. Yep. Just search Liberty Weekly. You'll find it.
Yeah, I really am enjoying MeWe, and since I have a page there, believe it or not, Pat, they actually show my content to the people who like the page, unlike Facebook, where I have people who tell me they like the page and they haven't seen a post from it since. And so that we get like a lot of good interaction and reaction to the post there. So if you're already on MeWe, definitely search it up. And like the page. So the last thing I had to plug is the show sponsor, Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeStore.com is where you go to get your CBD products. I really like their topicals, stuff you can rub on an area in your body you're experiencing a little pain and have that relief and have it go away. The usual co-host of the show, Will Porter, is a fan of their products that are infused with melatonin. They help them with insomnia. So whether it's a physical ailment or a mental health thing going on, CBD may be something that could help you. Check out the website, PalomaVerdeStore.com. They have an education tab there, and then you could pick out a few of their products to try and use the promo code PEACE when you check out, PEACE, and the show gets a kickback on that deal, which is absolutely fantastic. So you help out the show and you get yourself some great products at 25% discount. Again, PalomaVerdeStore.com, promo code PEACE when you check out. All right, Pat, let's get into this. And I think this is almost the most important thing to talk about when it comes to China, even though in a way it maybe isn't the most important. I mean, there are, 12 million people, 12 million Uyghurs in China, but that's what, 1% of their population. They have just an absolutely massive population there. When you look at things like the trade war, you're talking about billions and trillions of dollars in commerce affecting, the entirety of world markets, Taiwan, Hong Kong, the South China Sea. All these are really big issues that in some respects probably mean a lot more and would impact the lives of Americans a lot more than what's happening to this small percentage of the Chinese population. But yeah, it seems to me that at least most of the normies, if not most people in general who are hawkish on China, focus in on this Uyghur issue. I think part of that is because everything else is complicated. The trade war, even if they're in favor of it, has the brand name Trump on it, and so that's problematic to some people. Also, to a lot of people who like Trump, are sympathetic to Trump, understand economics on a level above mercantilism, and understand how it's probably not very helpful for the United States to have these ongoing trade wars. And the results certainly haven't bore out in a way that it's been very beneficial to the U.S. You have like the COVID thing, which some people are upset with China about, but that has some anti-Asian racism stigma, attached to expressing that viewpoint, as well as that being something that Trump really played up on, being the China virus. So it has that stigma to it. The whole stuff going on in the South China Sea and the different strains of islands and reefs that people can't even possibly imagine, not to mention the South China Sea has the name China in it, and so it seems a little ridiculous that the U.S. would be trying to maybe dictate to China what was happening there, and then we're enforcing the territorial claims of countries like the Philippines and Vietnam, which we recently really fought a war against and lost. And so it's not like, it was the sympathetic sock puppet U.S. government there. And so I think with all these adding up are just complicated. Taiwan, complicated. Also, it's a little island right off the coast of China. What is the U.S. actually supposed to, do to anybody who looks at a map? I think could kind of see the problems with that. And so I think the most easy to understand, clear cut issue to most people in the anti China case is the Uyghur issue. They're committing a genocide, China bad. CCP is evil. And so let's start to get into this, Pat. And maybe I was just wondering your take. Why is this such a big issue right now?
I think you're right. I mean, I think it is deceptively simple, I would say, because you can go into it, and a lot of people in the mainstream media, but also the independent media, and that's who I focus on in my article. A lot of these folks do latch onto it. They can say, "Oh, genocide is happening. Genocide is what the Nazis did. Therefore, China equals bad." And it's a very safe position to have. So it's deceptively simple, but it's also a safe position to have. And so that's kind of my take on it. But as I dug more and more into it, I discovered that it is a lot more complicated than one would think. Because, of course, the way that I discovered this issue is that I watched Tim Pool all the time, and I noticed how in like 5 shows after another, he just railed on China and accused the Chinese government of doing all these atrocious things like forced sterilization, torture, forced labor, restrictions on freedom of religion, and gang rape, and all these ridiculous, I mean, these over the top allegations. And it got me very suspicious. So I'll hand it back to you, Kyle, there.
All right, Pat. So just to go back, the title of your article is "Independent Media Parrots Questionable Uyghur Genocide Claims," and you again mentioned you really focus on the Timcast and Tim Pool, who was bringing on this group China Uncensored, and we already talked about them a little bit, but let's get into the groups that are making the claims, I guess, that where these claims are actually generating. And then it's interesting that they end up on Tim Pool and in the independent media, because typically the independent media ends up being the side against, and throwing skepticism on these claims. But here you have it being the kind of opposite. And I think that does makes it seem more credible to some people when it's coming out of the mouth of Tim Pool, people who may not believe it when it comes from CNN.
Yeah, and I try to give credence to Tim Pool. I mean, he's good on a lot of issues, and maybe I give him a little bit too much credence for the benefit of the doubt, but he has platformed really good libertarians. I mean, I'm thinking of Dave Smith, Michael Malice, Eric July, Julie Borowski, Phil Labonte, and Luke Rudkowski was on his show for a few months, and I really enjoyed a lot of issues. However, let me just read you the title of some of his segments that he's been covering China with. China is colonizing the entire world, even as it extracts the U.S. This is how they win. China weaponizes U.S. wokeness, where they used to mock the white left. They know what they're doing. Joe Biden will sell the U.S. out to China on a silver platter if they ask for it. And of course, the Chinese Communist Party is profiting off its human rights abuses against minority groups. So that's the type of coverage that we're getting from Tim Pool. And if you watch his segments, you know that Tim Pool can get very animated, and he gets the most animated on these subjects. So we talked about China Uncensored. And it was very kind of disturbing to me to find out who these people actually are. And the Gray Zone has done a lot of the groundbreaking reporting on this issue. Max Blumenthal and I'm thinking Gareth Porter, right? Yep. So they've done a lot of great work on this issue. And there's another columnist whose name I can't pronounce, so I won't try. But I link them all in my article here. And they've uncovered the fact that these China Uncensored folks are actually part of this cult called Falun Gong. And Falun Gong is a New Age spiritualist movement that happened in Xinjiang in China during the 1990s. And at some point in time, They have a charismatic leader named Li Hongzhi, and I'm not a Chinese speaker, so I can't get that perfect. But essentially, what happened is that the members of this Falun Gong spiritualist movement ran afoul of the Chinese government in the 90s and were persecuted and expelled. So a lot of them, including their leader Li, they fled to the United States and to New York. And a lot of former members have accused Falun Gong of being a cult, and they have some really strange beliefs. Their leader has claimed that he can levitate and that he can walk through walls. He also claimed that he can use his mind to direct and order things to happen, and that aliens have begun to invade the human mind and its ideology and culture. It all centers around this meditation practice, and where practitioners basically they get a fa, it's called the fa energy, and the fa energy is implanted in their abdomen, and this fa energy heals them through these meditation exercises so that they don't have to have modern medical treatments. And once the Falun Gong came to the United States, their practitioners and followers started the Epic Times. And this isn't conspiracy theory. This was widely reported. I think there was a bombshell report by, I think, NBC, and maybe the New York Times too. Not always the most factual, I will admit, the most factual reporting, but um, they're widely considered to be credible. But independent journalists have also gotten this. And the Falun Gong on their own website reported that Li Hongzhi, that he addressed members of the Epic Times and NTD, which is another news outlet that was started um, by Falun Gong practitioners. And so the spiritual leader Li Hongzhi, he addressed in 2009 addressed the staff of NTD, New Tang Dynasty, and the Epic Times, and sent them on a mission, basically. And this is published on the Falun Gong's official website, that they need to infiltrate the media and to become regular media and to expose the evil of the Chinese government. So a lot of things that the Epic Times and New Tang Dynasty and the Falun Gong have been behind are these claims of organ harvesting, that the Chinese government have abducted members and disappeared members of Falun Gong, and that they have harvested their organs and sold them on the black market. So just some kind of crazy out there stuff, Kyle.
Right. And, as some people, I'm sure I get comments about, the cult label. And in one sense, I don't even want to use the word just because you're missing the point. But you tie in all the actual things going on here, and what the stated mission of outlets like the Epic Times are is to smear the Chinese government. And not that I'm particularly sympathetic to the Chinese government as a communist party. And on the last show, me and Will were saying how horrified we are that we're adopting a vaccine passport system here in the U.S. that in some ways resembles what the Chinese government is trying to do with their social credit system. And I don't want to live under that state. I want to oppose that. But at the same time, that's far different than the genocide claims. And so anyways, whether they're a cult or not, they are attempting to undermine the Chinese government, and that's their stated mission. And so anything they say should be taken from the perspective of, this is a group that has some mystical beliefs, that, and one of those beliefs is they need to undermine the Chinese government. So
Yeah, and I admire, hesitating to call them a cult because, who knows? I think it does detract from the point. But I will say they do have a charismatic leader, and they do live in a secretive 400-acre compound in upstate New York. So take that for what you will.
see, some people hear that and they're like, "Oh, you're trying to branch Davidian these poor people."
I see. Yeah, yeah, fair enough. Fair
So
enough.
But getting back to your article here, there's another character that his name is coming up a lot in all these reports and with all these groups. I was looking through just a new group that had apparently put out a study that independently confirmed and this is new from the last time. So there was the last time you were on the show, we talked about a report that they had put out claiming that there was genocide against the Uyghurs, and now there's an independently claimed report, and this same guy, Adrian Zen's names come up in both reports. So can you tell me a little bit about Zenz?
So Adrian Zenz is a German sociologist, and a lot of hay has been made about his Christian beliefs and that he's a fundamentalist Christian. He talks about that. Gareth Porter specifically goes after the fact that Zenz is not very good on LGBTQ issues, which I don't particularly care about. What I do care about are his neoconservative connections. Not only that, but the report that he actually put out, which is where a lot of these claims stem from, which is one that was thoroughly debunked by Gareth Porter and Max Blumenthal. And I've linked to that in my article as well. But what they talk about is how Adrian Zenz has manipulated the data. He cites studies that he performed himself that just the numbers just don't hold up. And a lot of what he claims to be genocide, basically, his whole claim kind of stems down to the fact that the birth rates have declined amongst the Uyghur population. And he says this is genocide by other means, genocide by birth control or preventing births in the first place. But a lot of this change, I mean, moreover, the fact that the population of the Uyghurs, I think, tripled since the 1950s from like 3 to 4 million to 13 million. It is the fact, it's a testament to the fact that genocide is not occurring. However, Adrian Zenz cherry picked his statistics, and a lot of it is easily explained by a shifting in the one child policy. From it used to be the Han Chinese were limited to one child, but then that was retroactively applied to the Uyghur Muslims. And a lot of it also can be explained by voluntary birth control, that women in the rural regions of Xinjiang province have gotten access to family planning and to contraceptives. So rather benign explanations kind of explain his entire reports away. But the fact remains that neoconservative think tanks have used his reports writ large to say that a genocide is occurring.
Yeah, that's and so do you know about the second report I'm talking about? I think it's like from the New Foundation.
The New Lines Institute?
Yes.
Yeah, so one thing about the New Lines Institute is that it uses Adrian Zenz's study, but it also relies heavily on eyewitness testimony. And those are things that, Kyle, you and we explored a lot in our last article. I focused on Seragul Sautbay and Turnsene Zuiadan. Sorry, I'm butchering those names here, but basically Moon of Alabama has done a lot of work on how their stories change, and especially after these individuals are taken in through organizations connected to the U.S. State Department, such as Radio Free Asia, the World Uyghur Congress, and the Uyghur Human Rights Project. So the New Lines Institute used that testimony a lot, not specifically their testimony, but they also used testimony from a website called the Xinjiang Victims Project. And I don't necessarily have anything against these folks. I actually had a Twitter exchange with them that was amicable. But however, the database is often cited by these neoconservative policy papers to claim that genocide is occurring. But the fact remains that the victims database says right in its FAQ section that the testimony and the evidence presented is not to be taken as cold hard fact. They admit that they don't fact check and audit these reports. And just based on that value alone, what they try and do is let the cumulative effect of all of these reports coming in speak for itself. But it's troublesome. It's hearsay evidence. It's not admissible in a court of law. It hasn't gone through those. It doesn't have the indicia of trustworthiness that you get through the court process, the judicial process, where you would have these allegations, you would have these witnesses come in the courtroom and be subject to cross-examination. So you'll have to forgive me if I go on, Kyle. There's a lot here, but another thing about this is that this New Lines Institute was sponsored by a defunct university. And
Right.
it's actually,
It's crazy
yeah,
because you would think they would be able to get another university to do it, but this university wasn't just defunct. It was like kind of a scam university.
yeah. I mean, it's a private university that is, I think the U.S. Department of Education, and we're no fans of that as libertarians, but a day or two before the New Lines Institute paper came out, the Department of Education threatened to revoke this university's credentials because Kyle, there were only 40 undergraduate students that were studying at this university.
Right. And so this university, which has less students than any school in the rest of the U.S., probably, it somehow has a very prominent institute that's putting out papers about China that are independently verifying the claims made by Adrian Zenz.
Basically. And not only that, but the key, there's I'm really grateful to the Gray Zone because they, as soon as this came out, they actually kind of beat me to the punch, but they did an in-depth dive on this. They uncovered all of this about the New Line, or the Fairfax University of America, I believe it's called. Um, they did a lot of the investigative journalism behind that, and I don't know. They also audited a lot of the experts who collaborated on the paper, and I mean it's all neoconservative, hawkish groups behind a lot of the contributors to the paper.
Right. Right. Okay, Pat. So where should we go from here? I mean, so the information isn't correct, but yeah, it's being parroted anyways. And the overall goal of this is obviously, to further demonize China, and again, do it in a very simple way, in a way that appeals to the people in power right now too. This is an administration that was the essentially the JV foreign policy team for Barack Obama, and they were all about responsibility to protect. We have to intervene when genocides are happening. So, where do we go from here?
Well, I think it's very careful, Kyle, because again, the world is not black and white. Things are very complicated, and there's actually evidence that there are some troubling things happening in China. And I think we have to approach this soberly, and we have to look at the evidence and audit the evidence. Of course, as non-interventionists, anti-war folks, I I'm very I would try to advise people to be very careful about their rhetoric, because even if you are very thoughtfully denouncing, let's just say less than libertarian actions by the Chinese government, that can, even if you don't advocate war, the neoconservatives can use that as fuel. Not just neoconservatives, but the war hawks can use that as fuel. So I think that we need to be a voice that's soberly looking at this evidence. I think that we need to challenge people who are parroting these claims as fact. And I think that we need to be fair at the same time and even-handed and say, look, yes, there are vocational education and training facilities that exist in Xinjiang. Um, we don't know how many Uyghurs are in these camps. We know that the Chinese government says that these camps are there to rehabilitate Uyghur Muslims and to make them more a part of Chinese society. But what this really seems to me is like the United States policy when it comes to the American Indians, or the United States policy when it comes to the Japanese during World War II. So no, it's not a genocide, but it definitely is not libertarian.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that's a fair point. I guess how much more extreme is it than the American prison system as it exists? Specific,
Exactly.
and then even more if you look at like the ICE detention facilities and stuff like that. They have what 1,200 kids rounded up right now and locked up in those things, and I mean the whole thing's a mess. You see this? They're forcing these kids to wear masks and have them in fish tanks packed in their 25, to what 10 by 10 foot tank. It's absolutely insane. Um, just the treatment of American prisoners, even if there's massive amounts of rape in U.S. prisons, even if there are rapes going on in those camps, and so I guess that would be my comparison, and how much libertarians should feel the need to denounce something is, if the American prison system is about as bad as China's, then we should probably just worry about ours.
Yeah, exactly. And specifically with Tim Pool, I believe Tim has mentioned Yemen in the past. Um, but if these folks are crying foul of China and doing it as vocally as people like Tim Pool have, I'd like to see where they were during Yemen. And I think Tim has mentioned that, but he hasn't denounced it quite like he's gone after China. I'll
Right.
tell you that.
So there was an interesting episode of the Scott Horton show recently with Larry Wilkerson, and you got had some things to say on that. So what's going on? How's that tie in with this?
Okay, so Colonel Larry Wilkerson, he gave a speech in 2019 at the Ron Paul Institute. And I think his speech was in his speech, he said some things that were controversial and some things that especially piqued China's interest. And he was saying basically that the United States has no general strategy in the Middle East, no coherent strategy in the Middle East. And he said, if I were to postulate on what a coherent strategy would look like, it would, specifically in regards to Afghanistan, the coherent strategy would have three prongs, right? The first strategy would be to have a military presence in one of the most inaccessible areas in the entire world, and especially one that's close to the Chinese land-based Belt and Road Initiative. So that would be the first prong. The second prong would be to have strong military force next to Pakistan, where Colonel Wilkerson, where he reasons that the world's most unstable nuclear stockpile exists. And the third prong would be to have military forces in Afghanistan, which would be very close to Xinjiang province. And military forces there could provide cover, these are his words, for any kind of CIA covert operation that might exist were, this is important, were the United States and China to devolve into a hot war. So then it would be convenient in that case to have military forces in Afghanistan to provide cover for CIA operations to destabilize the Xinjiang region. And the reason for that is because the Uyghur Muslims do not like the Han Chinese. Xinjiang, so the Uyghurs are a Turkic Muslim ethnicity. They're a minority. However, their ethnic home is in Xinjiang province. Um, Xinjiang has been considered widely to be China's frontier. And a lot of Han Chinese have been moving into that area. Now the populations are comparable, but the Han Chinese have been moving into that area, and China would really like to get their arm around the Uyghurs and to bring them closer because the Uyghurs are kind of they're a very rural people. So the Chinese government would like to put their arm around them and recuperate, rejuvenate them or get rid of their culture essentially so that they become urbanites and good factory workers.
Yeah, they want to
So
assimilate them into
basically, yeah.
the Chinese party, whatever Communist Party culture.
So a lot of so first off, if they want to use them as workers, it doesn't make sense that they would want to kill them. But in the last 20 or 30 years, there has been terrorism in Xinjiang, and there's been separatist movements in that province. So it would be, were a hot war to break out, it would be a great asset for the CIA to have a foothold with American forces in Afghanistan to meddle and destabilize the region. On the other hand, sorry, it's storming here. I don't know if you can hear that, but um, on the other hand, there are radical there are radical Islamist Uyghur terrorists, and it was widely known that a lot of them fought in Syria on the side of the CIA and Al Qaeda. It's also, it's unclear, but it seems that Turkey, a NATO ally, was giving support to these Uyghur forces in Syria fighting in Idlib. And Colonel Wilkerson just had an interview with Scott Horton last Friday. And in that interview, he said that there are rumors in the international community that those fighters are returning to Xinjiang province from Syria, and that possibly the CIA and Turkey are aiding them in their journey back through Afghanistan and into Xinjiang. And I just want to be clear that Colonel Wilkerson was not saying that this is actually happening, but he's saying that there's rumors and that he's heard this.
Right. So, there's a couple points on that I think are important. The first is that Uyghurs did fight with ISIS or al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, HTS, whatever they want to call themselves for Jelani in Syria. And I mean, saw reports 5, 6, 7,000 fighters were enlisted with ISIS. Who knows if some different ones were fighting with different factions, or how that all breaks down. But certainly it does seem like there were Uyghurs who traveled either from Afghanistan or Xinjiang province in China to fight alongside. And that wasn't unique. There were Muslims from all over the world, from the U.S., from the Caribbean, from Europe, from Chechnya. There was a ton of Chechens there, from the rest of Central Asia, all enlisting within that fight. And at that time, it was a big deal to have all these fighters flowing in to fight against the Assad government there. So it seems reasonable to me that there would be up to 20,000 Uyghurs that were in Syria. And now maybe that number only seems a little high, because I assume that some of them would have been killed in the fighting and stuff like that. But who knows how many traveled. And then as far as it goes, the evidence of where they're going now, certainly the remaining jihadist element in Syria is in the Idlib province, which Turkey is the geopolitical power in control there. So if the Uyghurs were leaving Syria, it would make sense that they were traveling through Turkey. Now, are they going to Afghanistan and then China? I don't know. I bet China believes that, though. And that's, I think, probably the more important point here, is that because of what the U.S. has done recently, it's pretty believable that this will be something going on. And so China is living probably with that reality.
Yeah, and from China's perspective, I mean, these are trained, bloodthirsty Islamic terrorists.
Yeah, and we know what America does with, when we believe and perceive the, terrorist threats and stuff like that. So, anything else from that Wilkerson interview? It was very interesting. I highly recommend people check that out. I'll throw the link in the show notes page. And he is saying that I don't think he was laying out that this would be my policy for Afghanistan, or he thinks that this is happening, or he endorses it happening. Just that would be his, or what a sensible Afghan policy would be, and what a potential policy that what the CIA could be doing with Uyghurs.
Yeah, and that's important to note, Kyle. I'd like to be very careful that the listeners would go and listen to his actual words, because I don't want to misrepresent what he's saying.
Right. All right. So Pat, what else do we have in your article here? Any points that I'm really missing?
I don't think so, except for the fact that I didn't really link this China Uncensored to NTD itself. But there's a great YouTube video that I link in my article, which illustrates exactly how the cast of China Uncensored are practitioners of Falun Gong, and in fact that they film China Uncensored in the NTD studio, even though they say that they aren't affiliated with NTD. They're a subsidiary of it.
Wait, and they claim to be unaffiliated?
Yes, they do. Yeah,
Oh wow.
and in fact, I mean, this guy, Nathan something. I can't remember his name right now. Let's see. Nathan Rich, I believe his name is. He did a very in-depth video about this where he proved pretty convincingly that they are NTD affiliates.
So, Pat, you've been pretty vocal about this on social media, on your library Odysee page, which everybody should subscribe to both Liberty Weekly and Conflicts of Interest on Odysee. But you've been pretty vocal in your opposition here. Have you, I don't know, like, are people like at all looking to confront Tim Pool over this other than you, or other people, propping up this China Uncensored narrative? Or it has, I don't think I've seen like Tim Pool particularly himself interact with you, but has anybody like tried to respond and defend having this group on?
Not particularly. I mean, I have gotten some comments from people who are like Trump supporters saying that I'm wacko insane for believing anything China would say. You get that smear. I think it's, people hate China so much that they'd be willing to believe anything about it, when the truth is somewhere in the middle. So, but no, I haven't had nothing from Tim Pool. I figure I'm not important enough to address. Some libertarians do, they do buy into this narrative though.
Right. Yeah, that's the reason I wanted to take so much time to talk with you about it. Is I feel like on when it comes to Russia, Middle East wars, everybody's on board. But then there's this weird thing that happens when you start talking about China, and they go, "Ooh, no, but China's a real threat." And it's this really weird boomer vein that continues to run through a good section of even the right that isn't pro-war, that the more anti-war right is concerned about China. People who as you say, will stand up against the endless wars in the Middle East, or even conflict with Russia, like a Scott Adams is very hostile against China. And so we really need to take apart this narrative, because I think it's the easiest one for people to kind of latch onto and say, well, the Chinese government is evil. This proves that we have to do something about it. And it's at least a lot more complicated than a genocide. And, you know, I don't know, what else is there?
Yeah. And I mean, just to go off that, it seems like people in the United States we're bred and brought up through all of our schooling to believe that the United States is the greatest country in the world and that it will always be that way. And I do believe that to some degree. This myth of American exceptionalism, maybe it's just something I've lived with, like we all did. But that can be weaponized to that if there's another kid on the block who is I don't know, getting to be as powerful, or they convince us that they are, then we definitely have to do something about that and stamp it out. And that it's a big existential threat to Main Street, in the middle of Wisconsin, or in the middle of Texas, the middle part of America, as Scott Horton would say. And that's just a myth. We had we talked about that David Stockman video, I think, on the last time I was on to talk about this. And people should listen to what David Stockman has to say about China. I mean, he thinks they're just a big paper tiger that's inflated with fiat currency.
Right. Well, I mean, it likely is.
Yeah.
One of the other, I guess, things that comes with China and U.S. China policy is it is a major competitor. The Chinese Communist Party does repress the entirety of its citizenship. I don't have any illusions about this being like a global force for good or anything like that. And there may actually be some cases where China takes policy actions that are against U.S. interests, that are actually the interests of not U.S. interests as in the Taiwan Strait, but U.S. interests as in trade policy and how all that is playing out. Like, what kind of subsidies are going on or something like that. And if you're really concerned about that, then maybe that's the one narrow arrow, place in diplomacy the U.S. should focus on talking with China. And yet we end up condemning China for all these other things going on that really aren't American interests at all. Like the Taiwan Strait, that's not an American area. That isn't a place where we should be concerned. If China were to choose to invade and try to conquer Taiwan, I don't see what the U.S. could do about it, and we would really have to consider if we get involved. China may decide that nuclear warfare is the path to go, and Taiwan is probably a great place. I wish those people well. I wish them to be able to live free lives. Not going to trade San Francisco for Taiwan. Same thing with Hong Kong. Same thing with all these resound in the South China Sea. And so, again, if you really want to look narrowly at trade policy and feel like there maybe is some unfairness going on in what the Chinese are doing here, ultimately, I think focusing and playing up on this Uyghur situation is distracting from that, and it's undermining China and U.S. relations and able to maybe work out something better. People, I guess, always feel like the most like throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. You keep throwing it at China, you see what sticks. It gives you the most leverage, the more spaghetti that's up on that wall. That really doesn't make sense. Now you just got more areas you got to try to clean up.
Yeah, and so I mean, in closing, I just say that, I have nothing against the average Chinese person. They have not done me any wrong, and that's who we're talking about here. We're talking about people. We're talking about individuals, and yes, a lot of them are probably members of the Chinese Communist Party, but they never did me any wrong personally. They're just individuals, and we're all just people. It's our governments that pit us against each other. And I'd also leave with a quote that has been attributed to Frederick Bastiat, although I don't know if he said it, but that quote is, "If goods don't cross borders, then soldiers will."
Right. It's so important that we keep this trade relationship up with China for that reason. Well, Pat, thank you so much for coming back on the show. Tell people where to find you. What's your Twitter handle? I know on Facebook and MeWe you're just Liberty Weekly. Your show's up at the Libertarian Institute. People could listen to the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed. Your show's video versions on YouTube and on Odysee. And of course, if you go to Odysee, you get donate the awesome Odysee currencies to the show. So really appreciate when people do that. Pat, what are like all the details?
Yeah, so libertyweekly.net is the website. I cover libertarian legal theory and other topics. I'm going to be writing columns for the Libertarian Institute, as well as my podcast being on there too. So those are two places you can find me. And on Twitter, my handle's at liberty_weekly.
All right.
So thanks a lot, Kyle. Really appreciate it, man.
Thanks so much for coming back on the show, Pat.